I've often thought that if you don't, periodically at least, feel like a hypocrite, you probably aren't really engaging with your faith. The kind of thing that has to push you forward is your sense of not really living up to the gospel, not really living up to the commands of Christ. If you did that perfectly, what more would there be to do? You meet people who will criticize Christians as being hypocrites.
Right.
You say one thing and then you do another, but in a way, it's just part of the condition of being a Christian.
This is the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush,
And I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
and we have a longer program today because we had such a fantastic guest. And so, David, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time introing this. Our guest is Andrew Pudewa. For a whole lot of our audience, there's no other introduction necessary. If you don't know who Andrew is, you're about to. And let me just say, and we'll talk about it more as we start the conversation as we intro him. This was a great conversation. It was a fun conversation. And I've left considerably smarter than I started. So we hope you enjoy our conversation with Andrew. Well, it is my pleasure to welcome Andrew Pudewa to the Be Unbound podcast. One of the cool things about having a podcast is it gives you an excellent excuse to invite people on to have a conversation with them that you would want to have conversations with anyhow. And I have had the distinct pleasure and blessing of having multiple conversations with Andrew, every one of which I've walked away considerably smarter than when I started the conversation. And so I'm delighted to have the opportunity to present him to all of you so you can listen as well and walk away smarter. But Andrew is the founder and director of the Institute of Excellence in Writing. I am a huge fan of IEW. I have let me think about this. I have 3 children who have taken all the courses and graduated. They have all had significant professional success, primarily based upon their writing ability, and that's across a wide range of different careers. I have 2 students currently I have the rest of my children will be taking IEW. So first of all, we're job security for Andrew. And secondly, we're massive fans of it. And I have watched my children confidence grow in the writing. I've watched them be able to write so much better. And we're to the point now where my children don't want me to publish anything that they don't proofread because they don't have the same confidence in my writing ability as I have in theirs. And honestly, they're generally, that's true. So Andrew, let me make sure I get this correct. You're the father of 7 and grandfather of 16. Do I have the numbers right?
You do, and I will append that by letting you know I have actually 2 more grandchildren on the way.
That is awesome. So a grandfather of 18. So that is
Yeah,
really
they're
exciting.
coming fast and furious, and it's the best thing about life. I always tell young people, plan ahead, have as many children as you can so that you have the best chance of having as many grandchildren as possible. You have the best chance of some of them living near you because the only really good thing about getting old, other than, wrinkles and white hair, is grandchildren.
Well, in that sense, you look like you're doing it right with 18 grandchildren. That's fantastic. And then finally, I would just say that I know Andrew is both a speaker and a teacher. Those things don't always go together, but I know him as somebody who absolutely excels at both. And through those things, he has been an absolute mentor to me. And recently, I've had the distinct pleasure of calling him his friend as well. And so, Andrew, we're delighted to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I will reciprocate by letting you know that whenever I mention your name, it's usually followed by one of the absolute best people that I have ever met, doing some of the best work on earth. So I think we can join the Mutual Admiration Society.
I'll take it. That's not as good as perhaps having 18 grandchildren, but it's at least a start. So I think it's a good first step on the road there. So Andrew, we were talking just before we started recording, and I said, look, here's the problem. There's 17 things, 18 things, 20 things we could talk about on a podcast. And maybe we do 20 episodes, but we probably don't want to do them all at once unless David's not really been convinced that we should go to long form yet. I've suggested it a
I
time or
don't think
two,
that we're quite at Joe Rogan level yet.
Yeah,
We're on our way, not quite.
I think David just had the idea of me talking for 3 hours or having to listen to me for 3 hours and decided he's definitely not getting paid enough for that. So with that in mind, we had a couple of different things we talked about. But Andrew, one of the things that I have interacted with you with in the last couple of years is that you got particularly interested in fitness and wellness and health in a bunch of different ways. And as an endorsement of your ability to teach and to speak, it's something that you became interested in and then quite quickly that overflowed to those around you. And it was something that I had some interest in and a little bit of background, not professional or formally, but I had run cross country in college. And so I had some ongoing fitness interest and things like that. And yet, in the last couple of years talking to you, I feel like my entire perspective on some of these things has completely changed. I've learned so many things. And it was just an interesting sort of example of you learning something and then immediately that overflowing to other people. So tell us a little bit about that journey, because I think it has impacted some other things that we've talked about and that you have spoken to our students recently. And so it was an interesting window into some of who you are and what you do.
Well, I would say in great part, my interest in fitness and well-being and health and longevity was prompted by grandchildren. It actually was kind of almost a mystical supernatural moment I had. I was outside at a swimming pool playing with grandchildren. You know, you throw them up in the air and you catch them and you playing tag and you're jumping off and you're daring them to do various things in the swimming pool. And I was just so overwhelmed with this incredible joy. And then the next step was me realizing how time is short, and the older you get, the shorter the time is, and these kids are growing up fast. And I realized what I really, really would like more than almost anything else I can think of is to be able to see them grow up and have children and actually be able to swim and wrestle and play chess with great grandchildren. And then I did a little math and I thought, I'm going to have to live a certain length of time and I'm going to have to live and be healthy enough to do things like swim and wrestle and play chess. And that kind of corresponded with some other factors I won't go into great detail. To me, it kind of illustrates how very often the hidden hand, the Holy Spirit, providence will orchestrate various influences in your life that then kind of coalesce and you see something in a completely different way than you ever had before. And so this one of the coalescing factors was COVID, and my whole calendar shut down. I didn't go anywhere for 16 months. And I've been traveling 100 some days a year for 20 years. So to not go anywhere for 16 months was a radical lifestyle change. And it took me a little while to get used to the fact that I'm not getting on an airplane anytime soon. My youngest child had left home, and my wife became, for some reason, kind of uninterested in cooking. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to eat, I'm going to have to cook it. And I started cooking. Cooking got me interested in nutrition. My son is a personal trainer at a gym, and he got me into this idea of weightlifting. And I started to read more and more and more, and I just started to get really excited about how we're made. Our bodies are made to heal themselves. Our bodies are made to be strong. Our bodies are made to resist disease. And so many of the things that we suffer in that physical area are avoidable. Not all, of course, but so many things can be avoided or minimized through lifestyle elements. So I just went, full into it. And I do have a habit in my life of whenever I get really excited about something, I just go way down the rabbit hole. I just kind of ignore other things and want to pursue that area almost exhaustively and sometimes for several years. And then I'll sometimes go on to something else, but this is one of those cases where I'm still deep into it. I mean, I listen to 2 or 3 podcasts almost every single day that are somehow connected with nutrition, lifestyle, wellness, exercise, training, habit formation. And I think the biggest lesson I would share is my awareness now of the integration between physical, mental, and spiritual discipline. And that's something I never had before because, well, I was 60 pounds heavier, well, 50 pounds heavier than I am now. And I was winded after walking up 3 flights of stairs. I would, eat whatever was at the restaurant. My wife always fed me well. But once I started to really tune into what's good for my body, it was a natural extension to have some habits of mind that I wanted to incorporate, and then some some habits of prayer and contemplation and spiritual reading. And one book, I know you know this book because I've mentioned it before, Atomic Habits by James Clear. I read that book and it was a very reaffirming, like I'm on the right track. And wow, here's a lot of ways I can do better. And I ended up creating a pretty extensive spreadsheet that I fill out every single day on the things that, I'm trying to do and succeeded or didn't, or to what degree. And I've been doing this now for a couple years. And so the consistency of physical discipline has really carried over into those other areas. And in particular, prayer life and the discipline of prayer life, which for me was also not a strong point. I was busy running around, business owner. I've always got something really important to do. I've got to go help somebody with this or teach somebody that or make a video and I have reprioritized so many things as a result of this that, I don't really think it's possible to reach your best possible potential at any given time in an intellectual or a spiritual way without also attending to some degree to the physical platform upon which that exists.
Well, the not this past base camp, but the one before, you were one of the primary speakers for our students. And you talked a lot about the connection between physical training and resilience, and especially physical training and spiritual disciplines. And I was also thinking about that recently, Andrew. Now this is going to sound like a bit of digression, but hang with me for a second. I think that there's a fascinating sort of discipline in tithing. And I have noticed it time and time again in my life, and there's lots of people that can tell this story, that by the example of my parents and the example of my wife's parents, tithing was a normal thing for us. And so when we got married, it was not some huge hardship. It was just a sort of expected that we would tithe 10% of our gross income. And so we did that. Now, we have been in various positions throughout life, and often those positions have been tight financially. And I've always been interested that whatever position we were in tight financially, the tithe never made a difference in it. In other words, it always winds up working out in some fashion. And it's not a prosperity gospel, and it's not like, we tithe and then it just gets, it's like an investment. It just has always been interesting to me that when I'm worried about money, or if I am worried about money, it's not that part that I'm worried about. And so I was thinking about that, and I thought there's a point there where there's an attitude that positions you in a way to trust God. And then I was thinking the other day, there's interesting how that parallels the same thing has happened to me physically, but it's been a harder struggle. I was an athlete in college, and then I've kept an athlete's mentality, which was stupid because I wasn't training at the right levels. So I would overtrain and injure myself, and then I would fall off the wagon for a long time. Overtrain, injure myself, and fall off the wagon. So my overall fitness was actually not that great because I didn't have this consistency in it. And then, as you mentioned, Andrew, you become a business owner, you've got things going on, and that's the first thing you can sacrifice. And what I've been learning recently is that there's a little bit of a tithe aspect, in that if you take the time to take care of yourself physically in ways that I can't explain, somehow there's still enough time to do the things that you need to do. And then there was one other step, which I was interested in, is maybe think about this as you were talking, is that I have always been good about praying at least at the end of the day. But I found myself a couple of years ago faced with a friend who was in a real challenging situation. I knew about it, and I said, well, I'll pray for you. I saw this friend about a year later. I just had this awful realization that I had prayed for him a half dozen times. And the situation he was facing was not a half dozen time prayer thing. It was a half dozen times a day prayer thing. And I thought, this is just ridiculous. Like, I believe that saying I pray for you is a really important thing. I'm saying it, but I'm not following up on it. And so, I started keeping a more precise list and a journal and all these kinds of things. And that requires time as well. And I'm fascinated to find that I'm spending way more time praying and way more time in physical fitness. And yet somehow it has not cost me dramatically in just not being able to get things done. Just in the same way that it doesn't necessarily make logical sense that I would spend 10% of my income on a tithe, and yet it doesn't impact me financially. And so I'm sure that if I think about it long enough, it's a logical breakdown, but there is a mystery there that I don't fully understand, and yet is really powerful and has impacted, and all those things have now kind of connected in an interesting way, where the spiritual reinforces the physical and the physical reinforces the spiritual. And I have to say, Andrew, that a lot of that came out of base camp 2 years ago, listening to you and sort of thinking about that, and then taking some of those ideas and applying it. So it's an interesting link between those three things that I've never really thought about before, but I end up seeing that pattern again and again. So,
Well, that's good to hear because, whenever I give a talk, I always, silently before the whole thing starts, I always just ask, the Holy Spirit, work through this, let whoever's out there hear whatever they need to hear, be sure that I say things the best way that I can. And I just really trust that however imperfectly I do it, that the Holy Spirit will use it for, someone's benefit. And, I always do have the attitude, of course, any public speaker, we like a big audience. I'd rather have a room of 1,000 people than a room of 20. But that's just a pride thing. When I have a room of 20, I generally want to say, God brought me here. Here's 20 people. Please be sure that I say something that someone in this room needs to hear. So I like that. As you were speaking, it reminded me of a couple thoughts. I I heard once an exact sermon on this idea of tithing your time. And you figure, okay, you got 24 hours, you should sleep probably 8. That leaves you about 16 hours. Well, 10% of that is about 1.5 hours. And are we able to give 1.5 hours somehow, in the way that we would give 10% of our income? And I think that's very challenging. But there are a couple I know of Catholic saints who kind of said the same thing in very slightly different ways, which would be summarized, kind of paraphrased in this way. When I'm busy, I pray for 2 hours a day, unless I'm very busy, in which case I pray for 4. We think that we know how to use time and accomplish a lot, but I think we've all had the experience where, hey, if we get in the groove and do something right, or we get the right answer and make an action, we can do something so much more efficiently. But what are the circumstances that allow for that burst of efficient use of time? Probably spiritual orientation, preparedness, a peaceful heart, a lack of being distracted by the things of the world. And so I can see very significantly, and I've had the same experience with money too, which is, it doesn't matter how much you make. If you give away your 10%, you're always going to have some problems, no matter how much you make, because your problems go up with your income. But there is always that sense of sufficiency because you're operating from a point of abundance. And this is something I've tried to tell young people. You think, oh no, I only make so much money. I don't have enough. I can barely afford groceries. I can't tithe yet. Well, what that does is put you in this condition of scarcity and of lack and of a lack of trust. Whereas if you do bring the, quote, first fruits, and you give that first, then you're operating from this mode of abundance. And I think we can do that with time, and we can do that with our funds. The other cute little thing I'll mention to you, when I married my wife, it actually was a yours, mine, and ours situation. So she had 2 children from previous relationships. I had 1 child from previous marriage. And then about 1 year exactly after we were married, we had our 4th child. And that was, for me, a single dad going to being of 1 to being a married dad of 4, having a new baby, trying to keep my wife home, and trying to eke out a living as a violin teacher, which is just not a generally high-paying category.
Mhm.
I was actually very afraid of having more children. And when just financially, it's like, this is it. This is the max I can possibly do, barely squeaking by. I was not really solid in my Christian faith at that time. And, my wife was saying, well, we need to be open to life. We need to be willing to welcome more children. And I was afraid of this. And, she kind of challenged me. And I thought, okay, if she's going to challenge me, I'm going to challenge God. All right, God, if you want me to have more children, you have got to pay for them because I don't see how I'm going to do it. And I wouldn't say the numbers were precise, but by the time the 5th child came along, my income had doubled. By the time the 6th child came along, it had doubled again. By the time the 7th child came along, I'm not sure if it was in the double zone, but it was better, and I kept thinking, "Man, I should just go for 12. I'd be really, exponential here." My wife capped out at 7, but it is that thing of trusting and having faith and having the faith of a child that your needs will be met, by our Heavenly Father, and that's exactly what we're called to do. It's just easier to read it in the Scriptures and say, "Oh, yeah," than to live it out in the decisions you make in life.
Well, that last part, especially, it's hypocrisy that always gets me where I'm teaching and saying something, and then all of a sudden I sort of pause, sometimes even with the microphone in front of me, and go, I believe this, but I don't actually, I'm not doing this. And one of the things that caught me here recently was that we talk a lot about Sabbath and resting with our students, and just say that this is a part of being a whole person and an educated person, is to acknowledge that there are times needed for rest, and that that's an optional thing. And we couch it in these terms and say, look, you know, it's about rest and recharge and all those kinds of things. But maybe fundamentally, most importantly, it's about you saying that and acknowledging that you're not in charge of your world, and that that God is actually in charge. When you say, I can't possibly stop and take a break on Sunday, or whatever day of rest that you have, I can't have, then you're basically saying, God, you can't run this church, you can't run this family, you can't run this business, you can't run this community. That solely is my responsibility. And when you think of it in those terms, and when I first thought of it, that was really a radical change for me and a different perspective. And it was interesting. I believe that, and for the most part, and perfectly, but certainly strive to live that out in my life. What was interesting was that I didn't believe it on a daily basis. And so there was some aspect of, I don't possibly have time to pray this long. I don't possibly have time to spend reading my Bible this long, until I caught myself literally behind a microphone talking about the rest thing. And all of a sudden, as my mouth is running, the back of my brain's going, if that would be true for a week, why would it not be true in a day? Well, why would you not be able to live that out? And almost feeling like I had to stop and confess in the middle of my presentation. And that was a really interesting thought, that, in the middle of the day, when I say, and I was thinking about your story of your Catholic saint who said that, when I'm really busy, I pray 4 hours. I've heard that. We smile and almost laugh. And I don't think that's the appropriate response. I think the appropriate response is to maybe cringe and be convicted, because that is certainly not my reaction when I have a really busy day. My reaction, if I really have a really busy day, is that I'll pray tomorrow. And at some fundamental level, that's me saying, I don't believe that this day is going to make it without my input. And that's a kind of a sobering realization, and a little bit of a conviction that I was hearing as you told that story. So,
Well, your use of the word hypocrisy or hypocrite, I've often thought that if you don't, periodically at least, feel like a hypocrite, you probably aren't really engaging with your faith, because that's the kind
Mhm.
of thing that has to push you forward, is your sense of not really living up to the gospel, not really living up to the commands of Christ, not really living up to the beliefs you profess. If you did that perfectly, what more would there be to do? So, I think that's very interesting, because, you meet people who will criticize Christians as being hypocrites.
right.
You say one thing and then you do another, but in a way, it's just part of the condition of being a Christian, until you have perfected Christian life, at which point you probably don't need to live any longer. And so I'm okay. And I'm when I realize that I have this hypocrisy, and I think we also, in a way, as Christians, we need to have a ready defense for the accusations that come against, Christians in general, or us specifically. You say one thing, but you don't do it. Well, that's okay, because at least I'm saying it and trying. Other
Right.
people
Right.
aren't even trying. So, something to think about in that way as well. But I'm amused in a way by the growth of these kinds of apps that are trying to help people be better people, right? So you've got, your Noom app to help you, eat better and exercise more regularly, and you've got your Habits app, and then there's even a Hallow app where it's like, pray with us, and we'll remind you throughout the day to pray, and that we can somehow get better at this thing called being a balanced human by using technology to remind us of those things we actually already know. And I'm not, actually for or against any of these apps, but I think it's interesting that in our increasingly frantic world, there's a greater perceived need for this type of assistance to be balanced in life. I don't think that this idea of an app that would remind you to do all these things would have been necessary, say, for a great grandparents or grandparent 100 years ago.
Yeah, there's a story that a friend of mine tells. His grandfather, who's still living, and I think I've heard his grandfather tell it as well, but I've mostly heard my friend tell it, remembers when he was a boy, his grandfather got their first tractor. So they were farming in Delaware, and his grandfather buys this tractor. And so until then, they've been plowing the fields with horses. And so he was very excited about this. And his grandfather was looking at the tractor and looking a little pensive and sober. And he said, well, this is exciting. And he was thinking about all the stuff they could do and the things that they wouldn't have to do and all this stuff. And he said, what's the matter, Grandpa? What are you worried about? And his grandfather kind of rubbed his chin and he said, that machine has headlights. And he had this realization that, it's a kind of story, it takes you a second to sort of the thing to sink in, right? But his point was that before, at the end of the day, the end of the day was the end of the day.
Yep.
And the horses were coming in and they needed to be fed, and you couldn't plow anymore without breaking equipment and damaging people and all those kinds of things. And all of a sudden he's looking at this tractor and going, that thing has headlights. And so the end of my day is no longer sunset. The end of my day might be when I get the work done. And the first time I heard that evening, I watched the fields 2 fields down from me light up because they had big searchlights on and they were harvesting corn well past midnight. And then when I went to church that Sunday, some folks at church were talking about how they had been up at 2 a.m. scrambling to get hay in before the rain had come. And I just thought, wow, that's an interesting kind of realization what's happened. But I think at some point earlier, there was this physical limitation. You knew that you're going to do so much. And then we went through a stretch where technology erased some of that, headlights and other things. And then I think, and Andrew, I'm interested in your opinion on this, I think you've almost got the pendulum swung back the other way, where now the very technology has made it apparent to us that there's an infinite number of things we can do, and that's clearly not possible.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like the circles turned the whole way around, and people are all of a sudden going, now this device that was making me so productive has just reminded me that there's no possibility of me actually being able to be productive enough, whatever that is. Therefore, there must be some other thing that I'm missing or some other way to navigate this reality. Is that your perception as well?
Oh,
or do you have thoughts on that?
absolutely. Yeah,
So,
I didn't know about the headlights, but as soon as you said it, I knew exactly
right,
where we go. Technology today allows one person to accomplish the work of dozens
right,
or hundreds. You think in the field of data processing and accounting, and I can do with a computer what used to take a whole office of people in terms of keeping track of information and money and all that, which means now I have to do that. So the more that you can do, the more you have to do. And we definitely are coming up against that wall that now we really can work every waking hour if we choose to. Whereas, like you said before, conditions limited that. The other thing I would add into the perspective here is that technology will atrophy whatever skill it replaces. So, for example, in believe it was the Phaedrus, Plato tells the story. Socrates is telling the story of the king of Egypt and the god Thoth. And Thoth says to the king of Egypt, "I will give you this new thing called writing, and you'll be able to record all that happens." And the king of Egypt says, "Well, thank you. We'll take your gift because we have to, but it will be a double-edged sword in that while we will be able to record all sorts of things, we will then see the decline in men's memory. And so the technology of writing, for which we're all very grateful, I'm sure, does have a corresponding dark side, which is we don't remember things like people did prior to writing or thousands of years ago. Now we really don't even remember any phone numbers because who needs to remember a phone number? Technology has atrophied that skill. So, what we also see is that your friend's grandfather had a set of skills that involved, say, the caring for horses and the maintenance of the plows and wagons, equipment, and all that, which without a reinforcement of that would be no longer necessary over one or two generations. And of course, new skills do come into requirement, but I think in a way it tends to narrow us. We tend to be less able to look at a broad range of situations and circumstances and problems and problem solve from a broad range of experience into saying, well, I know how to fix this kind of thing, but anything else, I got to go find someone else. So the specialization, in a way, has made us more productive, more efficient, but also narrowed the breadth of experience that we can apply to all areas of life.
So to some extent, that narrowing is good. I think that people tend to be paid more when they go deeper than broader. And that's not the only way to measure success. But in the long term situation, generally, if people can do more and more of what only they do well, they tend to be more and more rewarded for that. So there's certainly an advantage to expertise. But yeah, I'm listening to your story about Thoth and thinking the lack of memory is lamentable perhaps and observable. However, the gain of writing is pretty significant. So I'm wondering, Andrew, do you have a sense or even a bit of an internal guide? What is worth narrowing and what is worth outsourcing? Because there's certainly things that is it? I'm not sure. Is it good that I don't have to memorize phone numbers? Maybe it is if I'm using that cognitive ability to do something more creative and better, and I certainly don't have a necessarily measurement of that in my own life at the moment. So I don't have a lot of numbers in my head like I used to. The phone does that. Is that good or bad? At what point, how do you discern what narrowing is a loss and what narrowing is a deepening, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think it's a tough question you have to grapple with yourself. Certainly, my success is due in great part to the fact that I have done one thing and kind of got better and better and better at doing this one thing for 3 decades. And yet, there's also a breadth of experience that I had when I was younger that kind of allowed me to do many things with the one thing that I have got decently good at. So I think there may be stages of life, even. I think for young people to have a great breadth of experience and everything from, carpentry to electronics to pottery to cooking to all sorts of skills that are neither practical in a modern world or even necessary, they form, in a way, your facility in a broad range of areas, be they manual or intellectual in language or in maths or physical. And and one thing I believe is that when you grow up doing a lot of things with your hands, you have a greater appreciation for the effort that goes into things. And I kind of feel we have a problem in the modern education system because a lot of people are suggesting that we should start narrowing kids down into career tracks at younger and younger ages because then they'll get better sooner. And maybe that'll be good for them or for the overall economy. And I see the logic there, but I also realized that as a young person, I had a lot of very diverse interests. And in retrospect now, I can kind of look and see how, my interest in, war games built certain skills and aptitudes and thinking that carried into my adult life. My interest in history gave me this kind of breadth of awareness of the world that I don't think I would have had if I hadn't read a bit of history on my own. Even, things like martial arts, which I did as a kid, gave me this certain, facility and confidence in my body, and also an awareness and a quietness. So I think the things that we do, especially when we're young, we don't necessarily know why, and we're not necessarily going to specialize in those things. But I think that's part of the great gift in life is you have that, you know, period of life where you don't have to be super efficient and get everything done and, be stressed by the life you've created. You still have leeway and freedom. I heard an interesting thought was, you really spend the first, let's say, 25 to 30 years of your life getting ready for life.
Mhm.
And then you spend the next 25 or 30 years doing it. And then you spend the last 25 to 30 years reaping the benefits of it. And so I think when we are thinking about young people and education and opportunities, I really do encourage people to go out and have the greatest breadth of experience that they can, whether or not that looks practical to them or to their parents or peers or whoever else might judge that.
Yeah, there's so much there. First of all, I we'll have to have a whole separate discussion about the intersection of martial arts and war games. They played pivotal pivotal parts of my development as well. So that was just I thought I did not expect to see that come up. Chris Chin, who has been on the podcast, and you and I both know, has a story he likes to tell that a young man asked him when he thought he hit his stride in life. And Chris said, I think probably, and it was 47 was the number he gave, that was 40. And he said the young man was kind of surprised by that. But I certainly can relate and think that that's probably about the time I've started to feel like I know what's going on as well. So I think that's true. One last question before we kind of wrap this up. And I was thinking about that. I was curious if you think that your recent forays into physical fitness, and you said this thing you pursued, bled over to the way that you do the thing that you do. And I'll give you an example here. So I think that you're right in that the breadth of experience as you're younger. But a couple of years ago, I discovered that no matter how contagious COVID was, it wasn't nearly as contagious as motorcycles. And a friend of my son started riding a motorcycle, and pretty soon I was entertaining a motorcycle gang at my house. And just being a responsible father, I thought that the only reasonable thing that I could do was to also get a motorcycle and learn how to ride it so I could speak safety and wisdom into these young men that were at my house. At
Totally
least that's
selfless motivation right there.
it was absolutely selfless, David, and it worked fantastic on my wife, who saw through the entire charade the whole way. I mean, not even for a second.
Mhm.
But what I discovered was that I had a particularly stressful year that year and the next, and the total concentration of having to learn to do something that if you mess it up could possibly kill or maim you was wondrously refreshing in some ways and also totally absorbing. And I found to my surprise that a lot of other things that I did that had nothing to do with motorcycles got better
Mm.
because all of a sudden I had been in these ruts and it just blew open all my paradigms and gave me new perspective in ways that I just never, to me, it was just like, oh, this is a little hobby over here. And honestly, it was an excuse to finally be able to ride motorcycles. As I told my wife, if you make a man own minivans for 40 years, don't be surprised if he buys a motorcycle at the end of that, right? And so that was kind of what happened. But I was wondering, Andrew, certainly you had a breadth of experience when you were younger, but do you see that transferability still in that, you're doing one thing and doing it better and better and better? But that's unusual. A lot of people don't get better at the thing that they're doing. So do you think that part of the reason you've gotten better at that is because you've continued to do other things, or do you see a connection there?
I think part of what, and this would be very specifically about the fitness side,
Mhm.
and, nutrition and fitness, is I have become very precise about those things. So I eat very scientifically. I am trying to discern and follow very precisely the optimal program for strength and muscle growth and VO2 max and HRV rates and all that stuff. I'm trying to, be very precise. And I think that precision, even if it's what you might call a hobby, carries over then into daily work. And so I do notice that I hope, at least, that the way I teach and speak and write and do things, I'm able to do it with greater precision and therefore greater efficacy, and part of that is a carryover to it. Another obvious carryover is that if I am better rested, better fed nutritionally, better lower inflammation in my body and brain, well, that's just gonna make me be able to think better no matter what. So there could be an improvement there. At a certain point, you hit an age where, if you're not declining, you're actually winning the game against everyone else your age. And I don't know that I've hit that yet, but it's around the corner. There's no doubt. So maintaining, but I do think that when someone has a hobby, and we don't hear a lot of people talk about their hobby anymore. It's kind of an old idea. When my father was young, his hobby was model airplanes, radio controlled, and he would build them from scratch and he would do all the stuff that you needed to get them flying and control them. And of course, he became an aerospace engineer. So there was a carryover there. Then his hobby, once he became an engineer, was sailing boats. And so he put a lot of effort into sailing boats, which really has no specific bearing on aerospace engineering, as far as I know, other than maybe a meticulousness, an attention to detail. But he sailed and raced boats out of a love of the recreation, and I think that would have carried over. But you talk to young people today, and it's very rare, I would say, to talk to young people who say, "I have a hobby and I invest time in this." No, I'm on my career track and I spend all my time learning how to do this or that so I can, start my family and make money and be successful and all that. So I think maybe we've lost some of the craft, the attention to detail. And, with a hobby, there's not necessarily any deadlines or timelines. You can work on this thing for as long as you need to and get as ready as you can, but it's not a high stakes thing like you're going to lose your job. So I think we've lost a lot by not having a hobby. And then to the degree that that hobby has peripheral benefits, it probably does carry over. So like almost everything, the wisdom is in the balance. And so getting really, I was thinking about this the other day. Young people, start doing something and get really good at doing this thing that you're doing, and you will always be in demand. And the older you get and the better you get at doing it, the more in demand you'll be, because the people who were older and better than you are timing out, dying off, quitting the game. So at some point, you'll be near the top if you keep doing the thing you're doing and just keep getting better at it. But at the same time, enrich yourself with things that will grow the breadth of your foundation and not just the height of your ability.
Well, and I think the theme that I've seen pretty much, I think this has come full circle really well throughout this entire episode and this conversation has been having a holistic view of all of the different aspects of our lives and how really interconnected they are. And I think we tend to have such a compartmentalized view of the different aspects of our life and seeing our rest has nothing to do with our spiritual health and our skill at our investment in our hobbies has nothing to do with our how productive we're able to be at this specific work task. Yet those things are very much interconnected, even though the practical individual skills that we might be using actively, the things we might be thinking about when we're doing those things might be completely different. The tools that we are using, the mindset, the just how connected all the different parts of our lives are is really important. And I think that this conversation, Andrew, with what you've said about multiple different areas of life has really brought that out to me, at least. So I've really appreciated that.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Well, one of the things that Andrew is really good at is teaching writing. And so as we end this, we were discussing as we began that one of my kind of core ideas is that if you're going to be successful, you have to be able to effectively communicate through the written word. And that doesn't mean that you have to be a best-selling author, but it does mean that you have to precisely and correctly be able to construct written documents. And that has been a major thing for my children, but it has become a challenge in terms of students coming into the program. There seems to be a bit of a struggle with that. So, my final question as we wrap this up, and I do this not because, and the audience should know, IEW does not sponsor this podcast, so there is no connection that way. But I am a major, major fan of Institute of Excellence in Writing. I have seen firsthand what they can do. So the audience that listens to this, if they've got especially high school students, Andrew, who are looking to be prepared to have that ability to write and to effectively communicate, and they're looking for some help on that, where would you send? Would you recommend?
Well, we have 2 courses that were recorded over the past 6 years. The first one is called Structure and Style for Students, Year 1, Level C. And that is a first-year high school grammar and composition course. And I was very pleased to discover that there are a couple colleges now that can actually offer credit for this course, which I find interesting because they're giving, university level 1 full year of grammar and composition university credit, transferable accredited credits for what we offer as a first year high school
Right.
course. But this course, Structure and Style for Students, Level C, we have 2 years of it, year 1, year 2, and it presumes no previous experience. And most of the students who are in the course when we did the video were not already well versed in the structure and style stuff that we teach, the models and checklists and all that. So that would be a great place to start if you have a year or 2 years, and you can stretch it out. You can do it for college credit if you want to sign up for that, or not. Obviously you pay more for the credit, but I think that does a very good job of getting as much as possible to a high school student that they will find very, very useful and transferable into wherever they go, whether it's in higher education or work. The other course we have is a newly released course. We did this video after COVID, and we just got it edited and available in this new catalog, and it's called University Ready Writing. It's a 12-week course. It, again, presumes no previous experience or understanding with our system, and it teaches as much structure and style as you can in that shorter amount of time, but it also gets into some specific skills that are good for university students. For example, an advanced note-taking system that I think would be very, very handy. It's one of the best things that I have ever learned in my life, and to be able to share that and teach that. And then we get into some of the things that aren't as pleasant, like, formatting, APA, MLA format, that's stuff the kids have to do. And then helping them organize a larger writing project. So you could do either or both of those courses, but I would comment, Jonathan, that I think one reason that you and other people feel that the writing thing is worth fighting for, it's worth spending the time learning to write well, is maybe one step beyond you're going to actually need this in life, because you may or may not. And of course, the argument about AI is going to write everything for everybody, so nobody has to learn to do it. But here's a quote from Francis Bacon that I have often used that I think points to where we're going with this. He said, reading makes a full person, right? So reading maketh a full man, speaking maketh a ready man, and writing maketh an exact man. And so we see the correlation. You read well, you fill yourself up. You get into meaningful conversation, you have a little bit of debate, you have to be able to access information and pull together ideas and do it quickly. But writing is where you have the luxury of thinking a little bit more slowly and drawing together ideas in a very precise and hopefully effective way. And the real end of that isn't, oh, I wrote something that somebody likes or that got me the deal. The end of it is, I know how to think better. I have better grammar and logic and rhetoric, not because those are ends in of themselves, but those are the pathway to better thinking. And that's where I feel this danger of AI. If it gets to that point where people say, well, who needs to learn to write? Computers will just do all that. Well, who's going to do the thinking behind the AI? And who's going to be the discerning thinker reading the stuff written by the AI? So, in a way, even though this technology now is replacing the immediate need for many people to do a lot of writing, it in a way is increasing the intensity of the need for better thinking skills. So that's why I do believe I have some job security, at least in certain market segments.
Well, and as somebody who not so much uses AI on a daily basis, but certainly has looked into AI, and David and I did a whole series of podcasts on AI, and we've spent a lot of time taking it very seriously. And I tell people it's educational malpractice to not talk about AI at this point. I think everything you said is true. And I would just add to this is that AI will always be plastic. And what I mean is that it will always be the kind of, is there only a market for plastic deck chairs that
Yeah.
you buy at Walmart?
The
And the answer is
imitation.
yeah, and the answer is no. There's a market for all kinds of chairs, ranging up, including extremely expensive, personalized, custom-built deck furniture. And AI will always produce the deck chairs, and that doesn't mean there won't be a market for people. But the people that get paid more are the people that are making custom chairs.
Yeah.
And so, if you would like to be in that more successful group, it would behoove you to learn to write well, so that you do more than create plastic content. And if you want to tell real stories, and if you want to set yourself apart, as you want to really communicate real ideas that aren't plastic, then you're going to have to be better than the AI. And so, in many ways, I think it's even more imperative that you be able to write well, in addition to everything that Andrew said that I would absolutely agree with. I mean, if I couldn't have said it quite as well.
I'm going to steal your deck chair analogy. I love it.
Excellent. Do it. So, Andrew, thank you so much. It was so much fun to have you on. We definitely have to do it again sometime. And it is always a pleasure to spend any time with you. And as always, I've smarter and more excited about a whole bunch of things after our conversation than before. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, David, for facilitating. It's been a great talk.
Well, David, it was a longer conversation. It was totally worth it. And then we turned off the recording and we continued to have a long conversation. And that was fun too. Andrew is just an absolutely fantastic person to talk to. And I feel like, there would never be enough time for me to sit down and learn from him and his experiences. He alluded to it a little bit about some of the things he'd done with his father, and then some of the things he'd done. He had wide experiences earlier. We've heard him speak. He did our commencement speech for our student body last year at Apex. And yeah, his breadth of experience is pretty substantial. It's quite impressive, and it's always fun to talk to him.
Oh yeah, like we ended up talking about the value of war games and different board games for quite a long time, and ended up learning that he apparently met one of the original creators of Dungeons and Dragons back in the day. So yeah, wide breadth of experience.
Yeah, I'm to the point that if Andrew told me he met anybody, I'd be like, oh, that makes sense. Yeah,
Seriously.
absolutely. So there's so many things to take away from the stuff that Andrew talked about, but I don't know that there was a thread through it. But one of the things that I certainly picked up and remembered was the idea of constantly learning and I think, if you're listening to this and you're a young person, take Andrew's advice to heart here. Get as much breadth of experience as you can. Agree 100% that don't get locked into some sort of career track. And I'm not saying you shouldn't specialize. Our version of what Andrew said at the end there was having an attitude of mastery. So definitely get good at something, but don't hesitate to trade money for experience. And what I mean by that is if, you can choose between I can make more money or I get more experience, go for the experience early on. And then while you're getting that experience, really hone in on that, having an attitude of mastery, getting good at something. And then as you go on, follow Andrew's advice and continue to double down and get better. I think that's correct advice. But I also think you should listen to the other things Andrew said and the way he's lived his life, which is, and then continue to have this curiosity to go and to really dive into something else. I think that there's always a spillover into whatever else you do as that you learn those things, whether it's motorcycles or physical fitness or whatever else it is that's got your attention. The ability to have a great hobby and to be able to pursue that and really jump into it, I think has all kinds of dividends. It'll be a really fascinating podcast to just talk about that for 30 minutes sometime, David, and the importance of a hobby. But there's some really golden advice there to take to heart.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the other takeaway that I would put on top of that is just hearing him talk about this and hearing you mention, especially like mentioning Chris Chin when he hit his stride, is that I think a lot of the time in our current social media culture, we put so much pressure on ourselves to get to a very high level and to be like extremely skilled and extremely successful in all these different areas very, very quickly. And I think you only get to be able to have the breadth of experiences that Andrew has had over a lifetime of having experiences and having experiences where things are learned over a very long period and through a lot of failures as well as successes. And so I think another really important takeaway from this is you don't have to get amazingly good at everything immediately. It is perfectly okay to learn something over time and to just appreciate the experience of it. That's something I don't think that we do nearly enough with, honestly, most areas of our lives nowadays.
Well, we could be so immodest as to suggest that one of the best ways you get some experiences now is to take a look at Ascend. Our Ascend program would probably be the poster child for this. We were just having a discussion in my family recently about some different things that's happened through Ascend. And if you just talk about experiences, David, maybe you can help me as I go through I was thinking about Andrew, who was our commencement speaker at our
Mhm.
last event. And so as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about our experiences there. And we had something called the rest race and rest is definitely a misnomer. And it was a bit of an endurance event that we did at Apex. And our students are still grumbling about it and complaining about it and
Mhm.
the various things that happened to them there. They didn't like it. And yet it's this real touchstone that, people that were there and survived the rest race that happened. And then, we just finished our base camp. And so we talked about being there and the weather that happened at the event and then the funny things that happened and everybody yelling at David because of his, the way he judged the game show events and
Rigged.
it was all rigged and all these kinds of things and talking about our Merch Madness scenario, which everybody thought was hard to understand and that we had this kind of fallout from it. And if you heard, we did a podcast about it. And so anyhow, just talking about those things. And then, we're about to go to Capstone. And if I think last year about being in Colorado and the snow coming down and the kinds of things that happened there. And then for me, one of the interesting experiences was I went to bed in the last night and then I just heard this almost earthly music crack the door and echoing through the hallways of this hotel-like structure was this just beautiful a cappella singing, which turned out to be a lot of our students just sitting in one of the lobbies, just singing their hearts out through much. And I literally fell asleep listening to them singing hymns like a few stories down and it just echoing through the building, which by the way, we're the only ones in the building. So it's not like we disturbed neighbors. Those are experiences. And there's a variety of experiences in different places, in different locations with different people. And the ones that get remembered tend to be the ones that were harder or some are often funny or sometimes uncomfortable. I mean, more people talk about the rest race than anything else from Apex. And it was the thing that made them the most uncomfortable physically because they had to run up the hill and get soaked and all those kinds of things. But David, if you think about the last year, what are some of your Ascend experiences that come quickest to mind?
Oh man. Oh my goodness. There are so many. I think of every year. Like one of the things is that I think displays this really well is every year at our Apex event, we have a talent show with all of our
Right.
students and just the ridiculous variety of things that our students will get into and are passionate about and the hobbies that they have. Hey, we've talked about that a little bit this podcast that get put on display. Those are some of the most fun things for me. And then I would say even beyond that, some of the most memorable things, experiences are honestly just some of the conversations, frankly. I think those are typically the less culture shaping as far as broad student body, but as far as individual interactions, I think the conversations that happen at events, regardless of whether they are in late night mafia games sometimes or if they are just after sessions talking about takeaways, and I think that cannot be overstated as far as how much of an impact and how much of an impactful experience it can be to have those conversations with people at these events.
Well, those experiences are live at these events, and I think those are the richest ones. But
Mhm.
I was watching David, and I'm not sure if you're paying attention to this. We have a Slack, and so we have a Slack group for our students that our students participate in. And, like all students, they get into arguments and debates on there. Unlike most students, the arguments and debates that take place on Slack are often really encouraging and really stimulating.
Mhm.
And so there's been a very deep theological discussion in Slack and a couple different channels that I've been skimming through. I say skimming through. The reason I skim through it is because they post books in there. Yeah.
Mhm.
And so we've got some people, some theological differences. And I saw this comment that just really warmed my heart. And it said, hey, I'm going to ask some pointed questions here, really seeking to understand. So these are pointed questions, but understand that I'm trying to discern what you're saying. I don't mean this personally. And so then they asked these questions. And the person responded and said, those are some very pointed questions. Thank you for asking them. I didn't take it personally. That clarified my thinking. And here's the answers. But I had to really sit and think about these to be able to answer them. So I'm really glad that you asked because it sharpened my thinking. And I'm just sitting there going, what? Why can't our politicians debate like this? Why can't this be the kind of conversation that we're having in a market? Why can't our media sound like this? And so you talk about an experience is that what an enriching experience to watch a bunch of young people argue passionately about stuff that they believe really deeply in and do it in such an incredibly respectful way. And when I talk about, this is a theological question. There was a question about assisted suicide there recently. These are some of the hot button cultural issues. Several years ago, I distinctly remember a long running conversation about gun control and gun violence that went
I
on that
remember
was
that.
really, really fascinating. And here's what happened that doesn't happen in other places. You had people saying, that's a really excellent point. I'm going to have to rethink my position on this because, and I've seen that happen in multiple places where people actually do change their minds. So it's not this kind of, let's fight and deepen our divides. It's a coming together and people go, oh, that's a good point. And I remember on the gun control one, all sides of that wound up saying, I had never thought of it that way. That's given me something new to think about. To me, that's the whole point of education, right? And that's also the point of being a community. So those kinds of experiences end up being just really powerful and I think shaping for people. And we have the privilege of seeing that happen all the time. And we get to see it happen through Ascend. So if this sounds interesting to you, if you're looking for those kinds of experiences, make sure you check out beunbound.us, or you can learn more about what we do. If you check us out, if you follow us long enough, you probably run across Andrew Pudewa talking about us too, because he's been really gracious and generous in getting the word out about what we do at. And we're happy to return the favor and say, if you have any questions about writing or if you have any needs for writing, we just cannot find enough good things to say. Institute of Excellence in Writing. Check out IEW. I believe it's IEW.com.
We will make sure to link both of the courses that he talked about in the podcast episode down below in the show notes.
And just here, this is our absolute total endorsement of everything IEW does. I can just tell you as somebody who has witnessed students who have done this through Unbound, they're always excellent communicators, but more personally, I can tell you that every one of my children, regardless of whether they liked writing or not, have ended up becoming way above average writers because of IEW and have enjoyed the process. I don't mean they love doing all the homework, but ultimately have been engaged with the content. I just don't can say that universally about anything else that's out there. So absolutely check out IEW.com. And until next time, be unbound.